As you begin to include other materials into your essays, I want to take a few minutes to review and discuss the use of citations. When done correctly and meaningfully, the integration of direct quotes can elevate your essay. When done poorly, the integration of direct quotes can distract your reader and will appear as filler. In addition, when cited incorrectly, the use of outside sources can become a plagiarism minefield. Today we will cover how to successfully integrate your quote, basic rules about the use of quotations, and the difference between an effective citation and one that simply does not work. So let's start with the basics. Direct quotes should be bookended with quotation marks, and direct quotes should be cited. These two things are what tell your reader that you are quoting another source. If you do not have quotation marks, or if you do not cite the source, then you are running the risk of plagiarism. The third basic, however, is that the direct quote should be used with a sense of purpose. And that purpose should be more than the fact that you were assigned an essay where you needed to use direct quotes. So let's talk about how to integrate your source. The model that I'm going to use is the quote sandwich. And as you can see by this graphic, it can be a little bit convoluted. I'm going to give you a simpler model. The quote sandwich that I'm going to give to you is 5 basic parts. So the first is that you introduce the source of the quotation, and you introduce that source through the author's name and the author's credibility. You reference the author by the author's first name and last name, and you do not reference the author by his or her title. So you wouldn't say Mr. Smith or Dr. Smith, just say John Smith. The second is that you want to use an active verb to link the source to the quote. There are some active verbs that I will give you, but there are many more that you can use. So you can use verbs like writes, states, believes, asserts. So John Smith believes is the beginning of your quote. Then go ahead and insert your direct quote. You'll then want to cite the source by one of these 3 methods. The first method is to put the author's last name in parentheses at the end of the quote. The second is to put the author's last name and page number in parentheses at the end of the quote. And then the third is if the author is mentioned in the signal phrase and there are no page numbers, then nothing should appear at the end of the quote. I will talk about this a little bit more so that you can understand when you will use each type of method. And then you want to discuss your quote in terms of how it relates to your essay. So here's an illustration of the quote sandwich. New York Times reporter John Smith maintains that the practice of poaching news stories from smaller, less reputable sources has become pervasive in the digital reporting world. Smith clearly outlines how this issue impacts the quality of the news most people receive. Especially it has become more and more difficult to distinguish between real and fake news. It is an ethical imperative that reporters take the time to establish their sources clearly and consistently. So what I've done here is color code your quote sandwich so you can see the different aspects to it. I have given the credibility of the author in black. I've given the action verb in blue, the actual quote in red, and then the explication of the quote in green. So broken down, we've got the New York Times reporter John Smith as the top bun. The active verb in the quote would be the sandwich filler. And then the discussion of the quote would be the bottom bun. And I'm going to take you back just for a second because I want you to see just how much of this quote sandwich is the discussion of the quote. So it's not the fact that you've used the source, it's what you do with the source that really highlights the use of that outside source. I'm going to take a moment to circle back to the 3 citation methods that I referenced previously. The first method is to introduce the source by credibility and author in the signal phrase, and then at the end of the quote you put the page number. This is a model that we used often when we used more paper sources, but now as we're working towards more electronic sources, students don't have to use this method as often. That said, if your source does have page numbers, you do want to cite the page number at the end of the quote. So here's an example of this method. So as you can see, I have New York Times reporter, so that's his credibility, the author's name, and then at the end of the source, I have the page number. And the last thing I want you to notice is that because I have a citation right here, the period comes outside the citation. If there is no citation, and we'll talk about when that would occur in a minute, you would put the period on the inside of the quote. Otherwise, it goes outside the quote. The second method is to reference the source by both credibility and author name in the signal phrase. And when no page number is available, then you simply end the quote with the appropriate punctuation. So this looks identical to the first source. The big difference is because there is no page number and I've referenced my author in my signal phrase, then I don't need to cite him again right here. And again, because there is no citation, the period goes inside. I understand why students often do, once they've referenced the author in the signal phrase, cite him again after, and it's because I think they're afraid of plagiarism. And honestly, if that's a mistake you make, I'd rather you did that than not cite your source. But again, it's not necessary if there are no page numbers and you've cited your source in the signal phrase. However, I'm going to talk about the third method because this sort of becomes the best of both worlds. With the third method, what you do is you reference the source by its credibility in the signal phrase, and then you cite the source after the quote. And this is the best method when you do not have page numbers for your source, especially if you're worried that the lack of a citation would mean that you are plagiarizing. So again, if we look here, I have the credibility before the direct quote, and because I haven't named the author in that signal phrase, I can then cite the source at the end of my direct quote. And so of the three methods, I do prefer this one because it does allow you to cite your source. And again, the period is on the outside of the direct quote. And this is a second example because if you do happen to have the page number and you've referenced it in this manner where you do not reference the author by name, then you would put the author's last name, space, page number within your citation. There are some exceptions to these rules. If you've already introduced the author, either in your introduction paragraph or in a previous quote, you do not need to reference the author's full name or expertise. Simply reference the author by his or her last name. The third exception is if you need to edit the quote so that it will fit your sentence more smoothly, you can either put brackets around words that you've had to change or use an ellipsis to indicate that you've taken words out. If you're using these two techniques, it is not to alter the meaning of your quote. It is simply to make the quote fit your sentences better. And I'm going to show you especially how the bracket technique has been used. Here are some rules for analysis, because again, remember that the analysis is the most important aspect of your quote sandwich. It is the purpose of including that quote in the first place. What do you do with the analysis? You can explain why the quote is significant or interesting.
You can explain your interpretation of the quote. You can connect the author's point to your situation. Or you can give an example or exception to what the author is saying. The thing that is nice about some of these techniques is that they really highlight that you are in control of your essay, not your research. You're using that research for the argument that you have created. So now we're going to put this into practice. The source that I'm going to use is an essay called Once More to the Lake, which was written by E.B. White. And the quoted material is, "My groin felt the cold chill of death." What E.B. White meant by this is he was reflecting on the sudden revelation of his own mortality. So in one of my classes, my students were asked to write a descriptive essay wherein they returned to a place from their past. And in this essay, they were to tie their experiences to E.B. White's own essay. They desperately tried to use that particular quote, and they very rarely were able to do it successfully. And I'm going to show why. This is an ineffective use of that particular direct quote, and it's taking place at Disneyland. As the sun beat down on the unending queue, waiting to ride Space Mountain, I came to a realization. My groin felt the cold chill of death. Like White, my groin felt quite cold. So why doesn't this quote work? The first and biggest is that the use of the quote doesn't fit the situation. This is not a moment where the author is reflecting on mortality, and so the quote just doesn't fit. But the other is that it's actually a dropped quote because the author didn't integrate the quote correctly. So if you look at what I've highlighted here, a dropped quote is when you have no signal phrase leading into that direct quote. And instead, what has happened is that the student has put a period here and then just inserted the quote or quote dropped it in. And so what the student has actually done, or what students often do when they think that they have the problem of a direct quote, is they'll just put a comma there instead. And they think that they fixed the problem, but instead what they've done is actually created a separate problem because they now have a comma splice on top of a dropped quote. So really pay attention to the use of the signal phrase. And again, the comma splice is actually one of the most common problems that I see when students are inserting a direct quote. Here's another ineffective quote. As the sun beat down on the unending queue waiting to ride Space Mountain, my groin felt the cold chill of death. The ride is very scary. While the quote is better integrated than the previous one, again, it doesn't quite work. And it goes back to the fact that the quote isn't really appropriate for the moment, or the author hasn't illustrated why the quote is appropriate for the moment. And as you can see with the analysis, the author has nowhere to go. And that's why it's such a short passage. So let's go ahead and look at an effective direct quote. As the sun beat down on the unending queue waiting to ride Space Mountain, I came to a realization that was similar to that of E.B. White when he reflected on his own mortality and went more to the lake. Like White, my brain also felt the cold chill of death. Though I still have many years before my death, there's something unsettling about the pervasive nature of this amusement park. This is probably the best we're going to get with this particular quote in relation to Disneyland. But what I want to highlight is that we have set up the idea of mortality before the quote so that the quote makes more sense when the author references E.B. White. And then in the reflection, there's this continuation of why that quote is relevant. And the last thing that I want to point is that there is this use of brackets because the author had to slightly alter the word choice of the direct quote in order to make it fit the passage. And again, he didn't change meaning, he just changed a slight word choice. Here's another effective direct quote. As the sun shone down on the happy people waiting to ride Space Mountain, I looked at all those smiling faces and realized that my emotions paralleled White's when he wrote, "These times and these summers have been infinitely precious and worth saving. Though the park may change, it will remain eternal in my memories." And perhaps the reason why the quote works is because it's a happy idea in relation to Disneyland instead of a sad one. But what I again want to point out is that there is this use of brackets here. White is referenced only by the last name, but we have the page number after the direct quote, and again, the period in the appropriate place.